Jake Harrison sat in an airport terminal unlike any time before. Usually when he traveled, it was in a tailored suit, walking through private terminals and heading straight into first class with a personal escort. But today he wore jeans and a faded sweatshirt, his hair a little messy, glasses hiding his sharp blue eyes. No one looked twice at him, which was exactly the point. As the CEO of Liberty Wings, one of the top airline companies in the country, Jake had built an empire from a single leased aircraft. But lately, he had sensed something was wrong. Complaints were rising, online reviews hinted at unkind staff and stressful travel experiences, and employee turnover was at an all-time high. Reports from upper management said things were under control. But Jake trusted his instincts more than any spreadsheet. Instead of flying in luxury, he had booked a last-minute economy ticket under a false name. No one from the crew knew who he really was. He wanted to experience Liberty Wings not as a leader, but as a passenger. Vulnerable, unseen, and at the mercy of every decision made by his frontline employees. As he boarded the plane and squeezed into the narrow aisle seat, he took a deep breath. The smells of stale coffee, recycled air, and worn upholstery filled his nose. The noise of chatter, rustling bags, and overhead announcements buzzed around him. For the first time in years, Jake was on the receiving end of the service his company promised to perfect. He barely had time to get settled when something behind him caught his attention. A soft voice, strained with emotion, slipped through the hum of cabin noise. "I should have been there sooner," the woman said, her words barely a whisper but heavy with guilt and grief. Jake turned his head slightly, careful not to be obvious. The woman behind him was young, maybe late 20s, her face pale, and her fingers clutched tightly around a phone. From her expression, it was clear she was carrying more than luggage. She was carrying heartache. Then another voice responded, this one deeper, steadier, yet still tinged with sorrow. "You're doing the best you can. That's all anyone can ask of you." Jake glanced sideways. An older man sat beside the woman. He looked weathered but gentle, with a worn brown jacket and thick hands that had seen decades of hard work. There was a kind of shared pain between them, even though they seemed to be strangers. In those few quiet moments, Jake heard more truth about the state of his airline than in any board meeting he'd ever attended. He realized then that Liberty Wings wasn't just about flight schedules and stock prices. It was about people. People in crisis. People who depended on kindness at 30,000 feet. He had built this company on the promise of making travel easier and more human, but now he wasn't sure that promise was being kept. His heart sank as he thought of all the passengers, like the woman behind him, people going through the worst days of their lives, relying on strangers in Navy uniforms for just a little comfort. That single moment on the plane became a turning point. Jake didn't yet know what he was going to find during the flight, but one thing was clear. He had come here for answers, and now he was more determined than ever to find them. What began as a quiet test of company culture was quickly turning into a personal mission. He looked out the window at the runway stretching ahead. The plane would soon be airborne, and so would his investigation. Jake Harrison wasn't just flying across the country. He was flying straight into the heart of a problem that needed fixing, before it was too late. As the engines hummed softly beneath the cabin floor, Jake Harrison adjusted his seatbelt and glanced toward the back of the plane, his mind still echoing with the voices he had overheard moments earlier. The woman's voice, shaky, strained, had cut through the monotony of boarding announcements and the clinking of overhead compartments. She wasn't just another passenger. She was someone in distress. Jake listened more carefully now, ears tuned not as a CEO but as a human being. The young woman's name, as it turned out, was Emily Sanders. Through her quiet conversation with the older man beside her, Jake pieced together her story. She had booked this flight just hours earlier after receiving a call from the hospital. Her father had suffered a major stroke. The last-minute airfare had nearly drained her bank account, and the desperation in her voice was unmistakable. "I should have been there," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes as she clutched her phone like a lifeline. Beside her sat Frank Moreno, a man in his early 60s with a deeply lined face and hands that trembled slightly as he folded a wrinkled customs form. A retired firefighter, Frank spoke with a steady tone, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. He told Emily that this was his first flight alone in more than 30 years. His wife, who had always handled their travel plans, had passed away recently, and he now found himself navigating the world alone. She always filled out these forms, he said quietly, his eyes lingering on the empty seat beside him. Despite being strangers, Emily and Frank found something rare at 35,000 feet: understanding. Their shared vulnerability drew them together, forming a fragile support system in the cramped space of row 15. Jake sat motionless, his heart tight in his chest. He hadn't expected to feel anything on this flight beyond minor inconvenience, but now he was absorbing the very thing his airline claimed to value: human connection. Emily and Frank weren't just customers. They were people facing life's cruelest moments, and they were doing it alone, with only a few hours and a flight to help them carry the weight. Jake's mind raced as he thought about the policies his executives had approved. The surge pricing, the rigid change fees, the automated systems that treated people like ticket numbers. Somewhere along the way, Liberty Wings had shifted from being a people-first company to a profit-first machine. The quiet between the two passengers behind him was interrupted only by the occasional hum of the intercom. Frank gently offered Emily a tissue from his jacket pocket, and she managed a small, grateful smile. Jake stared ahead, deeply unsettled. If this was the passenger experience in economy class, emotional exhaustion met with indifference, what did it say about the company he had built? He could no longer deny the disconnect between the brand message and the actual journey his customers were taking. The glossy ads promised comfort, support, and care, but in reality, passengers like Emily and Frank were left to fend for themselves in moments when kindness mattered most. What troubled Jake even more was the thought that no one else around them seemed to notice. The flight attendants walked past quickly, focused on procedures and efficiency. No one stopped to ask why Emily was crying. No one offered to help Frank with his forms. The emotional landscape of that row was invisible to the system. Jake knew then that his undercover trip was no longer just a quality control measure. It was an awakening. These weren't isolated stories. They were signs of a larger issue, a culture that had lost touch with empathy. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Jake turned to look out the window, but his reflection in the glass caught his eye instead. He saw not just a man in disguise, but a leader on the edge of a revelation. Liberty Wings had the potential to be more than an airline. It could be a company that met people in their most human moments. But that vision had been clouded by bureaucracy and business metrics. Now, with each mile in the sky, Jake felt a new purpose taking flight inside him. He wasn't just going to take notes, he was going to take action. Because if the company couldn't care for people like Emily and Frank, it didn't deserve to fly at all. As the plane continued its slow climb into the clouds, Jake Harrison kept his gaze low, ears tuned for more than just cabin announcements. He had just watched two people, Emily Sanders and Frank Moreno, suffer in silence. And yet, as if fate had orchestrated it, someone finally stopped to notice. A woman with dark auburn hair pulled into a neat bun approached their row. She wore the Liberty Wings uniform, but there was something different in the way she moved. Unhurried, focused. Her name tag read Rachel Thompson. She knelt slightly beside Emily's seat, her voice low and sincere. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" The question wasn't rehearsed, nor was it said out of obligation. It carried genuine concern, and Jake immediately leaned in. He knew this moment would reveal more about his airline than any policy document. Emily hesitated at first, caught off guard by the unexpected compassion, but the kindness in Rachel's eyes seemed to unlock something. "My dad? He had a stroke this morning. I'm just trying to get to him," she whispered, her voice cracking mid-sentence. Rachel didn't interrupt. She simply nodded, one of those small, powerful gestures that said, "I hear you." Then, without drawing attention, Rachel adjusted Emily's seat, giving her a little more legroom and privacy. "Let me know if you need anything," she said gently, then disappeared for a moment, only to return with a warm drink. "This one's on us." Emily clutched the cup like it was a life raft. No forms to fill, no approval needed. Just one person seeing another person in pain and doing something about it. Then Rachel turned her attention to Frank. The retired firefighter was still struggling with his customs paperwork, his large hands fumbling as he tried to make sense of the fine print. "Having a bit of trouble?" Rachel asked with a kind smile. Frank looked up, embarrassed. "My wife used to do this part. I just signed where she told me." Rachel didn't laugh. She didn't minimize his struggle. Instead, she pulled out a pen and walked him through each section step by step, explaining gently and slowly. She knelt beside him like a daughter helping her father, her voice steady and encouraging. When Frank finished, he gave her a small, grateful nod, the kind that comes from a man not used to asking for help, but deeply thankful when it's offered. From his seat just a few rows away, Jake watched the entire exchange unfold. He had been searching for answers about what his company had become, and now, in the smallest of moments, he saw exactly what Liberty Wings were supposed to be. Not a logo, not a fleet of planes, but people, employees like Rachel, who understood that flying wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about carrying people through moments of fear, sadness, and hope. Rachel had no idea who Jake was. To her, he was just another nameless face on the flight. And yet, what she gave Emily and Frank, compassion, dignity, humanity, was more valuable than any premium ticket or loyalty reward. Jake's chest tightened with a complicated emotion, pride mixed with guilt. He was proud that someone like Rachel wore the Liberty Wings uniform, but he was ashamed that people like her weren't the ones running the show. He thought of the executives who had dismissed concerns about morale. He thought of the reports that emphasized speed and efficiency over care. And then he thought of Rachel, kneeling beside a grieving daughter and a widowed man, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. She wasn't just doing her job. She was showing what the job was meant to be. As the cabin lights dimmed and the flight settled into cruise altitude, Jake sat back in his seat with a different kind of awareness. Rachel Thompson had just delivered a masterclass in customer service. No training video could replicate what he had just seen. She reminded him of why he started this airline in the first place, to make people's lives easier, even if just for a few hours. And now, thanks to Rachel, he had found something even more valuable than profit or performance metrics. He had found a leader. A quiet one, perhaps overlooked, but a leader nonetheless. And Jake knew he couldn't let her story end in anonymity. Because if Liberty Wings was to be saved, it would be because of people like Rachel Thompson, not the ones sitting in the boardroom. The flight had settled into a soft hum. Passengers were flipping through magazines or drifting into light naps, the buzz of conversation replaced by the occasional call bell and the rattle of beverage carts. Jake Harrison, still seated inconspicuously among the crowd, had not taken his eyes off Rachel Thompson. Her presence on the plane had become a calming force, her gentle manner and quiet dignity drawing out human decency in a space too often governed by rush and routine. But just as Jake was starting to feel a sense of hope, that maybe, just maybe, there were still embers of compassion burning within Liberty Wings, a cold voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Rachel!" The voice snapped from the front of the cabin, sharp and brittle. It was Linda Parker. Jake turned his head slowly. Linda Parker, the senior flight attendant on board, approached with a frown so tight it seemed carved in stone. She was in her late 40s, every movement precise, her posture rigid, as though molded by decades of authority, unchecked. Her gaze locked onto Rachel with a glare that dismissed empathy as weakness. "You really need to stop babysitting passengers," she muttered loud enough for Jake, and likely others to hear. "You're too soft. You spend so much time holding hands and wiping tears that you're holding up the entire service." Her words weren't just cruel, they were calculated. And Rachel, in that moment, became a target of everything Jake had feared still lingered in his company's leadership. To her credit, Rachel didn't flinch. She offered no rebuttal, no defense. She simply took a quiet breath, adjusted her collar, and continued on with her work. A few rows away, Jake watched the fire behind her eyes dim slightly, not from defeat, but from the weight of having to endure such belittlement too many times before. She approached another passenger with the same gentle tone, offering assistance with a tray that wouldn't latch properly, and then she knelt to help a child who had dropped a stuffed toy. Her hands never trembled, but Jake could see the truth now. This wasn't the first time Rachel had been treated this way. It was just the first time someone powerful enough to do something about it had been watching. Jake clenched his jaw. This wasn't just an incident, it was a revelation. Liberty Wings, the company he had built on the promise of warmth and integrity, had become a place where kindness was punished, where leadership meant cold efficiency and compassion was seen as a liability. He thought of all the HR files he had skimmed, the smiling marketing videos his team had produced, and realized how far they had strayed from the mission. Rachel had been doing the exact thing the company claimed to value, and yet here she was, undermined by a woman whose seniority seemed to shield her from accountability. What infuriated Jake most was how easily Linda's words rolled off her tongue, as if she had said them 100 times before, as if she had shaped an entire team in her image, one where passengers were problems to manage, not people to care for. And Rachel, the only one trying to keep humanity alive at 30,000 feet, had been fighting that battle alone. Jake's fingers tightened around the armrest. This wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about a culture, a rot, spreading through the airline, invisible to spreadsheets and quarterly reports, but deeply felt in every aisle, every row, every sigh from a grieving traveler. He looked around the cabin. No one else seemed to notice, or perhaps they did and had learned, like Rachel, to look away. But Jake couldn't. Not anymore. He had built Liberty Wings from the ground up, and somewhere along the way the heart had gone missing. Now, staring down the cold glare of Linda Parker, he knew one thing for certain. It was time to take it back. Starting with the people who had turned leadership into intimidation and stripped empathy from the skies. This flight wasn't over yet, but its course had just been permanently altered. When the plane finally touched down, the cabin filled with the usual flurry of movement. Passengers unbuckling, reaching for overhead bags, stretching after a long flight. But Jake Harrison didn't move. He sat still in his seat, eyes narrowed, mind whirring. The events of the flight had peeled back a layer of his airline he hadn't seen in years. He had come looking for signs of broken service, poor attitudes, or logistical failings. Instead, he found something far more insidious, a culture that rewarded indifference and punished heart. And at the center of it all stood Rachel Thompson, a woman quietly embodying everything Liberty Wings claimed to represent, yet clearly buried under layers of silence and suppression. Jake knew this wasn't something he could walk away from. The moment his feet hit the tarmac, he wasn't heading home, he was heading to headquarters. Late that evening, the glass walls of Liberty Wings' towering headquarters reflected the soft glow of the city lights. Most of the building had gone dark, the offices empty, save for a few overnight staffers. But on the 52nd floor, Jake sat alone in his executive suite, the door locked behind him. With a few swift keystrokes, he accessed the internal employee database, his private clearance bypassing usual approval steps. He typed in Rachel's name. What he found stopped him cold. Her profile opened with a decade-long track record of excellence. 0 customer complaints, repeated high-performance ratings, dozens of glowing passenger commendations. Jake scrolled through years of incident-free flights, overtime logged without request, emergency situations handled with professionalism and care. In every measurable way, Rachel Thompson was not just a good employee, she was exemplary. But then came the part that made Jake's stomach turn. Promotion requests, several of them dating back almost 8 years, each one meticulously documented, each one denied. The justifications, copied and pasted with disturbing consistency. Not leadership material, lacks authoritative presence, too passive in high-pressure situations. Jake knew corporate language well. It was a veil, a tool to mask bias, to write off empathy as weakness. And suddenly, the flight with Rachel made even more sense. She had been doing everything right. By the book, by the heart, and still she had been overlooked. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. Jake leaned forward, his eyes narrowing further as he dug deeper into the promotion logs. A pattern emerged. One name kept reappearing beside each denied request: Linda Parker. The same Linda who had belittled Rachel during the flight, the same Linda who called compassion babysitting. The system showed that Linda had served on nearly every internal promotion review panel involving Rachel. Jake's hands tightened into fists. This wasn't a coincidence. This was targeted suppression, disguised as process. Under the surface of a billion-dollar airline, a toxic power structure had been thriving. One that propped up the loudest voices while silencing those who quietly made the biggest difference. The deeper Jake looked, the more disturbing the picture became. Not only had Linda blocked Rachel's upward mobility, she had actively recommended other candidates, ones with weaker performance histories, multiple passenger complaints, and far less tenure. Jake recognized several names from disciplinary files he had seen in the past, yet they had climbed, while Rachel remained grounded. It was a betrayal of merit, of fairness, and of the company's mission. Jake wasn't just angry. He felt betrayed. He had spent years building a culture he thought stood for something, but now it was clear that somewhere along the line his vision had been hijacked by gatekeepers, who feared being outshined by someone truly good at their job. Jake reclined in his chair, staring at Rachel's profile on the glowing screen. He thought back to her quiet grace on the plane, how she treated passengers with the kind of humanity that couldn't be taught in training. She had never asked for recognition, never demanded a title. She just showed up, day after day, and gave everything she had. And what had the system given her in return? Silence, dismissal, rejection. Jake knew he couldn't let that stand, not anymore. It was time for someone to rewrite Rachel Thompson's story, someone with the power to shift the tide. And Jake, now more than ever, knew that person had to be him. Because leaders weren't the ones with the loudest voices. They were the ones whose actions quietly changed the lives of others, whether anyone noticed or not. The office was quiet except for the soft ticking of the antique clock on Jake Harrison's bookshelf. Midnight had come and gone, yet he was still at his desk, staring at the screen that displayed Rachel Thompson's personnel file. The silence of the building only made the truth hit harder. Something wasn't adding up. Rachel's record was spotless, yet she had been consistently denied opportunities. Her reviews were glowing, at least the ones that remained. Several annual performance evaluations were simply gone. No explanation, no digital trail, just missing. It wasn't a system glitch, it was deliberate. Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He needed answers. Not from HR, not from Linda Parker. He needed someone who had once been inside the system, but no longer had anything to lose. That's when he thought of Tom Reeves. Tom had been with Liberty Wings for nearly 25 years, a veteran flight supervisor known for his fairness and no-nonsense attitude. He retired a year earlier, quietly, without drama. Jake had always respected him, even if they hadn't spoken much outside of formal meetings. Without hesitating, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed Tom's number. The line rang several times before a groggy voice answered. "Jake? It's the middle of the night. What's going on?" Jake didn't waste time. "Tom, I need to talk to you about Rachel Thompson. You remember her?" A pause, then a quiet, "Of course I do. One of the best we had." "Why?" Jake's voice lowered. "I'm starting to think she was intentionally held back, possibly sabotaged. I need to know the truth." Tom exhaled on the other end of the line. "Yeah, I figured it might come to this one day." He paused again, then continued. "Rachel wasn't one of them, Jake. That's why she never moved up. She didn't play the game." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. "What game?" he asked, though deep down he already knew. "The inner circle," Tom said. "Started years ago, a small group of senior staff. Linda Parker, Greg Marsh, a few others. They handpicked who got promoted, who got pushed aside. If you were part of their clique, you rose fast, no matter your performance. But if you didn't kiss the ring, You stayed grounded. Jake felt a deep weight settle in his chest. Are you saying they've been running a shadow system inside my company? Tom chuckled bitterly. You always ran it with good intentions, Jake. But while you were focused on the big picture, they were building their own little empire inside. Rachel was never going to get through. Too honest, too pure. She made them nervous. Jake stared at his monitor. The gaps in Rachel's record, the denied promotions, the recycled excuses, they were all starting to make sense. And the missing reviews? He asked. Tom didn't even hesitate. Scrubbed. I remember hearing about it. Linda and her crew didn't want anything on file that could justify a promotion for Rachel. They wanted her stuck. The revelation was like a punch to the gut. Jake thought of the meetings he'd attended where Linda presented reports with confident smiles and hand-picked data. He thought of the times he praised Liberty Wing's culture publicly while this rot spread silently beneath the surface. Why didn't anyone say anything? Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. Fear, Tom replied. They had influence. They could freeze you out, change your schedule, make your life miserable. Most people just kept their heads down, but Rachel, she never compromised. That's why they made sure she stayed invisible. After the call ended, Jake sat in silence for a long time. The room felt colder now. The truth was ugly, undeniable, and deeply personal. People like Rachel had been sacrificed so that mediocrity could thrive. Jake wasn't just angry, he was ashamed. This wasn't what Liberty Wings was built for. It wasn't what he had poured decades of his life into. But as painful as it was to uncover, he was grateful for the truth, because now that he knew the game, he could finally dismantle it. Rachel Thompson had done her job with honor. Now, it was Jake's turn to do his. And it would start by tearing down the inner circle, brick. The first rays of dawn filtered through the towering glass walls of Jake Harrison's executive suite, painting golden lines across his desk. He hadn't slept a minute. The events of the previous day, the flight, the revelations about Rachel Thompson, and the truth about the inner circle had pushed him into a state of focused determination. He was still seated at his desk, reviewing the final pages of personnel audit logs when his phone rang, breaking the silence. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something told him to answer. "This is Jake," he said, voice calm but sharp. On the other end came a voice he hadn't expected to hear. Benjamin Carter, a billionaire investor known for his selective and high-impact investments in the aviation sector. "Jake," Benjamin said, "I just flew Liberty Wings yesterday. There's someone on your crew I think you should know about." Jake straightened in his chair. "Rachel Thompson?" he asked without hesitation. Benjamin chuckled. "So you do know? Good. I watched her help a young woman in distress with a level of compassion I haven't seen in years. It wasn't for show, it was real. And frankly, it left a mark." Benjamin went on to explain that he had been evaluating Liberty Wings for a potential long-term partnership, one that involved a multi-million-dollar investment in expanding regional routes through a shared aviation fund. "I was on the fence," he admitted, "but seeing how your people treat passengers, or at least how Rachel did, made up my mind." The contract, Benjamin said, was ready to move forward, and Jake knew exactly who to thank for that. He barely had time to process the impact of that call when his assistant, Monica, walked in with a notepad and a stunned expression. "Jake," she said, eyes wide, "you just got another call. Frank Moreno." Jake looked up. "The firefighter from the flight?" Monica nodded. "He's actually well known in the emergency services community. Apparently he's part of the National First Responders Association. He called to thank you personally and, get this, he wants to recommend Liberty Wings as the preferred airline for their new travel program for veterans and emergency personnel." Jake blinked, stunned. That kind of contract wasn't just an honor, it was a game changer. It would bring in thousands of loyal travelers, government recognition, and a level of national goodwill money couldn't buy. Rachel had no idea she was responsible for any of this. To her, it had just been another day of doing the right thing, helping a grieving daughter, assisting a man who felt lost without his wife. But to the people she touched, it meant everything. Jake found himself staring out the window, the city below still waking up, and he couldn't help but smile. Not the kind that came with profit margins or boardroom victories, but the kind that came from witnessing the ripple effects of genuine decency. Rachel's kindness wasn't just a quiet act. It had become the catalyst for financial opportunities his executive team had been chasing for years without success. He thought of all the marketing consultants they had hired, the PR firms, the data analysts, all trying to crack the code on customer loyalty, and yet here was Rachel Thompson, doing it without strategy sessions or corporate jargon, just through simple human care, in an industry obsessed with metrics. Her value had gone unseen, but now she had secured more for the company in a single flight than some executives had done in entire fiscal years. Jake leaned back in his chair, a mix of pride and urgency pulsing through him. Rachel didn't just deserve a promotion. She deserved recognition, authority, and the ability to reshape Liberty Wings in her image. It became clearer than ever. If Liberty Wings was to thrive in the future, it wouldn't be because of flashy upgrades or aggressive mergers. It would be because of people like Rachel, whose quiet actions built trust in ways no marketing campaign ever could. Jake picked up his phone again, not to call Benjamin, not to call Frank, but to begin setting things in motion internally. There were decisions to make, structures to change, and when Rachel walked into the office later that morning, still unaware of what her kindness had ignited, Jake would be ready. Because today wasn't going to be just another day. Today was the beginning of a new era at Liberty Wings, sparked by a woman who thought she was just doing her job and ended up saving a company. The morning sunlight had barely crept over the city skyline when the first wave of urgent emails hit inboxes across Liberty Wings corporate headquarters. The subject line was short, sharp, and unmistakably serious. Emergency leadership meeting, attendance mandatory. Within an hour, executives, HR directors, senior flight supervisors, and department heads began flooding into the 15th floor conference room, whispering nervously among themselves. No one had ever received a meeting summons directly from Jake Harrison, let alone one scheduled so early and with such urgency. Linda Parker arrived with her usual confident stride, whispering something sarcastic to her longtime ally Steve Mitchell, the head of in-flight operations. Probably another PR drill, she scoffed, but as they entered the room and saw Jake already standing at the front, with a large screen behind him and a set jaw, her smirk began to fade. Jake didn't waste time. As the last of the seats filled, he cleared his throat and addressed the room in a voice calm but edged with steel. Yesterday, I took a flight on Liberty Wings. Unannounced, in economy class, like any other passenger. What I witnessed was a culture in conflict with everything we claim to stand for. A stunned silence settled over the room. He clicked the remote in his hand and the screen behind him lit up with a profile photo and employee record. "This is Rachel Thompson," Jake said. "She's been with Liberty Wings for 10 years, 0 customer complaints. Dozens of handwritten commendations from passengers, multiple perfect performance reviews." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Few knew Rachel's name. Fewer still had seen her face, but Jake wasn't finished. He clicked again and a chart appeared. Promotion requests over the last decade, all denied. Despite her record, Rachel has been passed over repeatedly for promotions, he continued, with reasons such as too soft or lacks authority. He turned to Linda and Steve, whose faces had gone pale. "Those decisions came from you," Jake said quietly, "and today we're going to talk about them." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but Jake held up her hand. "You've told your teams that compassion is weakness, that helping passengers isn't productive. You've built a culture that favors control over care, compliance over conscience." His voice sharpened. "That ends now." He motioned toward the back of the room. A quiet figure stood up. Rachel herself, summoned earlier but seated unnoticed. "Rachel, would you please join me?" Jake asked. Eyes followed her as she made her way forward, confused, unsure why she had been called into the spotlight. Jake turned to her and then to the room. "I reviewed her flight yesterday. I watched her comfort a grieving daughter and assist a widowed firefighter with a level of grace and professionalism that reminded me why I built this company in the first place. He paused. So, as of this moment, Rachel Thompson is officially promoted to Director of Passenger Experience. The room gasped. Rachel froze. She looked to Jake, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You've earned this," he said softly, "and Liberty Wings is going to be better because of you." Then, turning sharply to Linda and Steve, he delivered the final blow. "Linda Parker, Steve Mitchell, you violated the spirit and standards of this company. You're both terminated, effective immediately." There was a stunned silence, then a slow, quiet wave of whispers as the room began to process what had just happened. Two of the most powerful figures in Liberty Wings, removed in an instant. And in their place, a woman who had spent a decade doing everything right, but receiving nothing in return. Security entered the room discreetly, escorting Linda and Steve out as they sat frozen in their chairs, too shocked to argue. Rachel remained by Jake's side, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. "You weren't invisible," Jake said gently. "They just wanted you to believe you were." And with that, the meeting came to a close, not with applause, but with a sense of quiet revolution. Those who had once ruled through fear and favoritism were gone, and in their place stood someone who understood that leadership wasn't about control, it was about care. A new chapter for Liberty Wings had begun, and it started with one voice finally being heard. Just when it seemed like Liberty Wings had turned a corner, the darkness that had long thrived in its hidden corners began to push back. Rachel Thompson, newly promoted to Director of Passenger Experience, arrived at work each morning with the same quiet grace she had always carried. But now, the stakes were different. Her name was known, her authority was real, and her reforms, centered on compassion, fairness, and accountability, were being implemented across departments. Frontline staff finally had a voice, and passengers were starting to notice the change. But not everyone was celebrating. One rainy morning, as Rachel sat at her desk reviewing training materials for the new People First initiative, her assistant Naomi rushed in, clutching a printed email with shaking hands. "You need to see this," she whispered. The paper trembled in Rachel's grasp as she read it. "You don't belong in leadership. You're making enemies. Stop before you're stopped." There was no sender, no traceable IP, just a chilling warning wrapped in bitter contempt. Rachel didn't panic, but her stomach turned. The message wasn't vague frustration. It was a threat. She reread the line, "Stop before you're stopped," and knew instantly that her reforms had struck a nerve with someone entrenched in the old guard. She debated telling Jake, but decided to wait, at least until her scheduled board presentation that afternoon, where she would unveil Phase 2 of her department overhaul. If fear was their weapon, silence would not be hers. Hours later, Rachel stood confidently before the board of directors, presenting a new training protocol aimed at reshaping Liberty Wings culture from the ground up. But as she clicked to the next slide on the projector, the screen filled with something horrifying. An email that looked like it came from her personal account. An offer of bribes to junior staff in exchange for glowing reviews and public praise. The room erupted in murmurs. Someone at the table gasped. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward. "That email is fake," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I've never written anything like that." But doubt had already begun to seed in the room. Some board members exchanged uneasy glances, while others tapped their phones beneath the table. Just as the pressure began to build, Jake Harrison entered the room. He had heard about the forged email within minutes of the slide going live and arrived with his tech security chief in tow. "Everyone stop," Jake commanded. "This is a deliberate attempt to undermine one of the best leaders this company has ever seen." He nodded to the security chief, who immediately connected a device to the conference room monitor. Within minutes, a digital audit traced the origin of the forged email to an internal access point, one that belonged to HR Director Megan Lee. The room fell into a tense silence. Jake wasn't finished. He turned toward the board. "And she didn't act alone." With another command, the screen refreshed, showing a chain of hidden communications recovered from the internal server. These messages, coded and disguised under generic subjects, were traced back to Charles Benson, Vice President of Corporate Affairs. The evidence showed coordination, discussions about slowing her down, planting doubts, and even manipulating her internal evaluations. Jake stepped back from the screen, his voice low but fierce. This isn't just sabotage, it's corruption, and it ends today. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, not out of fear, but out of clarity. The very people who had smiled in meetings and nodded during her presentations had been working behind her back. Desperate to preserve the system she was trying to reform. Megan Lee sat at the end of the table, pale and wide-eyed. "I was following orders," she whispered. Charles Benson, red-faced, started to speak, but Jake cut him off. "You were destroying a career, undermining trust. You don't get to speak now." He turned to the board. "I will not allow Liberty Wings to regress. Not under my leadership." Security was called, and within the hour, both Megan and Charles were escorted from the premises. Their access was revoked, their titles stripped, their legacy, if it had ever been honorable, was over. But for Rachel, the moment was more than vindication. It was a stark reminder that real change didn't come without resistance. When you try to shift a system built on fear, the people who fed on it will fight to survive. That night, Rachel sat alone in her office, the city glowing through her window. She could still hear the echoes of support from the employees who had texted and emailed after the news broke, but she could also feel the weight of what had happened. The threat email, the betrayal, the forged evidence. It was a war she hadn't asked for, but one she was now firmly in the middle of. Jake knocked on the door and entered quietly. "You okay?" he asked. Rachel nodded slowly. "I will be." He handed her a folder labeled Next Steps, but his voice softened. "You've already won the hard part," he said. "They came after you because they knew you were changing everything." Rachel looked down at the folder, then back out the window. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. She knew now that real leadership was forged not in applause, but in fire, and she was just getting started. The morning after the boardroom chaos, Liberty Wings was a company holding its breath. The news had already begun to spread. Rachel Thompson, the once overlooked flight attendant turned director of passenger experience, had survived a brutal smear campaign and uncovered a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of leadership. But the firestorm wasn't over. As Jake Harrison sat at his desk, reviewing the internal damage reports, his phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. Captain Alan Pierce. A respected pilot with more than 2 decades at Liberty Wings, Alan had always kept his head down and focused on flying. But this time, he had stepped forward, quietly, courageously, with a piece of evidence that would shatter the last defense of those clinging to the old regime. Attached to the message was an audio file. Jake hit play, and within seconds, he knew everything was about to change. The recording was clear. In it, Megan Lee and Charles Benson could be heard discussing Rachel's promotion, and more importantly, how to stop it. "She's too public now," Megan whispered. "We'll need something concrete to make her look unfit," Charles responded with eerie calm. "Forge it. An email. Something that puts her integrity in question." The rest of the conversation confirmed their plan to fabricate evidence and plant it during her board presentation. Jake listened, jaw clenched, as they laughed about how quickly people would turn on her once the lie was believed. This wasn't just professional rivalry, it was sabotage, malicious and premeditated. And now, thanks to Captain Pierce, it was undeniable. With the recording in hand, Jake walked straight into the executive legal suite and requested an emergency session with the board. That afternoon, the entire board convened once again, this time not to debate policy, but to witness justice. Jake played the recording. The room sat in stunned silence. When the final word echoed off the walls, all eyes turned to Megan Lee and Charles Benson. Megan looked as if the air had left her lungs. Charles tried to speak, stammering something about context, but no one was listening. The truth had arrived, and it had spoken in their own voices. "I recommend immediate resignation," Jake said flatly. not asking, but commanding. The board unanimously agreed. With the weight of exposure hanging over them, Meghan and Charles had no choice but to step down on the spot. Security led them out quietly, without ceremony. Just like that, two of the most powerful people in the company were gone. With their exit, Jake launched a full-scale internal investigation. An independent task force was appointed to audit every major personnel decision over the past 5 years. Rachel, still reeling from the attack, was invited to assist in reshaping the company's accountability systems. Employees who had previously been silenced began to speak up, sharing stories of blocked promotions, erased feedback, and veiled threats. The very culture that had kept Rachel down for a decade was now being dismantled, piece by piece. For the first time, real reform felt not only possible, but inevitable. Rachel emerged from the ordeal not just as a survivor, but as a symbol of quiet strength, of moral clarity, and of what it truly meant to lead. But as she returned to her office that evening, exhausted but determined, a new challenge was already forming on the horizon. Jake stood by the window, arms crossed, the city skyline reflecting off the glass. "There's something else you need to know," he said. Rachel, still catching her breath from the day's events, looked at him curiously. Jake turned and handed her a folder. Inside were documents outlining early-stage negotiations for a corporate merger, one that would fold Liberty Wings into a much larger, profit-driven airline conglomerate. "They want to consolidate operations," he explained. "And your department, your reforms, they're not part of their model." Rachel's fingers tightened around the folder. Just as she had begun to rebuild the soul of the airline, someone was preparing to erase it all, in the name of efficiency. The news hit her like a wave, but not with fear, with resolve. The battle she had just fought had shown her what she was capable of. And if those trying to merge Liberty Wings thought she would quietly step aside, they had no idea who they were dealing with. She looked up at Jake, fire behind her eyes. "Then we fight again," she said, and Jake, without hesitation, nodded. "We do." Outside, the city pulsed with light, unaware of the storm still brewing within the walls of Liberty Wings. But inside, Rachel Thompson was preparing not just to defend what she had built, but to ensure that no one could ever tear it down again. The war wasn't over. It had only changed shape, and this time, she would lead from the front. The towering glass walls of the Liberty Wings boardroom reflected a stormy sky the day Victor Langston walked in. Polished, silver-haired, and surrounded by a cadre of executives in crisp suits, he carried himself like a man used to winning. As the CEO of Skybridge Airlines, a larger and more commercially aggressive airline, Victor had made a career out of mergers, swallowing smaller companies whole, gutting departments, and optimizing operations for maximum profit. To him, Liberty Wings was just another acquisition. Another brand to absorb, another culture to flatten. What he didn't count on was Rachel Thompson. She wasn't listed on the agenda. She wasn't even expected to be in the room. But as Victor settled into his chair and began outlining cost-cutting measures, starting with the elimination of the passenger experience division, Rachel entered the room, calm, unshaken, and unapologetically uninvited. Victor glanced up, clearly irritated. "Miss Thompson, I don't believe you were scheduled to attend these proceedings." Rachel stepped forward without hesitation. "I believe you're discussing the future of a department I built. I intend to be part of that conversation." Jake Harrison, already seated, gave her a slight nod of encouragement. The room fell into a heavy silence as Rachel opened a folder and laid several documents on the table. "Before you talk about dissolving what we've created, let's talk numbers," she said. 2 weeks ago, Liberty Wings secured a $50 million 0-cents investment from Benjamin Carter. In that same week, we also landed an exclusive national travel contract with the First Responders Association, thanks to Frank Moreno's endorsement. She looked directly at Victor. Both deals were a direct result of reforms made in the passenger experience division. Reforms that you intend to eliminate. Victor folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "Those are notable wins," he said carefully, but we believe similar programs could be implemented under our broader operations model. Rachel didn't flinch. You can't replicate what you don't understand, she replied. This isn't about checklists or policy updates. It's about culture. It's about trust. She turned to the other Skybridge executives. What we built at Liberty Wings wasn't transactional. It was transformational. You can't just transplant that into a system that treats passengers like numbers and employees like liabilities. Her voice remained calm, but each word struck with precision. Remove this department, and you're not streamlining. You're unraveling everything that made those deals possible. Jake leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. Victor, I've led this company since day one, and I've seen firsthand what Rachel's work has done, not just for our passengers, but for our bottom line. You want to talk numbers? The uptick in loyalty program enrollment, customer satisfaction scores, employee retention? It all began when Rachel took the lead. If you're serious about this merger, then the deal will include one non-negotiable condition. Rachel Thompson stays, and the passenger experience division expands, not contracts. The room went still. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by someone without a corner office or a C-level title. But the silence was broken by one of Skybridge's own board members clearing his throat. He's right, the man said quietly. If we want the goodwill that came with Liberty Wings, we can't dismantle what created it. One by one, heads began to nod. The tide had turned. Victor knew it. With a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he leaned back and gave a small nod. Very well, he said. We'll reevaluate the strategic structure. But Rachel wasn't finished. She turned to Jake. If we want to protect this for the long term, we need more than verbal agreements. Jake smiled and stood. Which is why, effective immediately, Rachel Thompson is being promoted to Vice President of Passenger Relations. She will not only oversee the future of Liberty Wings service standards, but she will help integrate those values across Skybridge's domestic operations. The announcement sent a wave of murmurs through the room. Victor shifted in his seat but said nothing. It was done. Rachel, once a quiet flight attendant kneeling to help an elderly passenger, was now one of the highest-ranking executives in the newly merged Airline. And she wasn't there by accident. She was there because she earned it, because she proved that empathy could be strategy, and that integrity wasn't a liability, but an asset. The meeting adjourned shortly after, but the shift in energy was unmistakable. Rachel had taken her seat at the table, and not just as a symbol, but as a force of leadership that couldn't be ignored or silenced ever again. A week later, Rachel walked through the terminal of a bustling international hub wearing her new badge, Vice President. Around her, staff moved with purpose and confidence. A flight attendant helped a nervous first-time flyer. A gate agent walked an elderly couple to their gate. None of it was staged. None of it was for show. It was the culture she helped create, one that was now taking root in places she hadn't even touched yet. As she turned a corner, she caught a glimpse of herself in the terminal glass, calm, composed, and smiling, not because she had won, but because she had stayed true. And in doing so, she changed everything. Thank you for being a part of this journey with Deep Inside HQ, where we go beyond the surface to bring you powerful stories of integrity, justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. If you believe in the kind of change that starts with truth and ends with transformation, then don't just watch. Join us. Hit that subscribe button, share these stories with someone who needs to hear them, and help us build a community that stands for empathy, courage, and doing what's right, even when it's hard. Your support is what keeps these voices alive, and every click is a step toward a more compassionate world.